Good morning. Thank you to everyone for joining us this morning, and in some places where some of you are tuning in, I know it's the evening time and other times for you all. We're very happy to welcome you all. My name is Sarah Tonucci. I'm Executive Director of the Rumsfeld Foundation, and on behalf of the organizers of e-CAMCA Week 2020, including our partners at the Central Asia Caucasus Institute and the CAMCA Network, we're delighted to welcome you to our very first live event of e-CAMCA Week. This morning, we're very fortunate to have with us Robert Zoellick. Among many other notable positions, he served as President of the World Bank, as Undersecretary of State, and as U.S. Trade Representative. He currently is at the Belfer Center at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's also with the Brunswick Group's Geopolitical Advisory. Among a number of other board positions keeping him busy. He also was just telling me he has a new book coming out on August 4th. So we're interested to hear some more about that. This morning, Bob is gonna share some initial remarks with us all, and then we're gonna open it up to Q&A. In order to submit any questions that you have for Bob, please use the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll be getting through as many of those as we're able to. Thank you so much, Bob, for being here with us. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Sarah. And first, for all the fellows, congratulations. This is a great opportunity. I've had a chance to speak to some of the fellows in prior years, and as you would expect, I think people are having the opportunity to learn as much from one another, and I hope this will create a set of friendships and networks for the future. Sarah asked me to start off by giving some of my thoughts on the international trading system in the COVID-19 environment. These are clearly very difficult days. I thought I would touch briefly on 4 topics. 1, changes in the trading system before the COVID virus. The second, the COVID effects. Third, my expectations for the medium term. And then to close, a few policy questions to consider, and then we can take any of your questions. So first, on trade developments before the COVID-19 virus. From 1990 to 2007, trade growth was approximately 2 times, even a little bit more than the growth of GDP. But from 2008 onwards, trade actually fell below GDP growth in most years. Yet the services trade, as opposed to the goods trade, grew about 60% faster than goods since 2007. So you saw shifts in the type of trade even before COVID. There were also very important regional variations. In some regions, you saw increasing concentration in areas such as autos, computers, electronics. You'd see new patterns of trade, particularly in East Asia. A lot of this depended on China because China was increasing its domestic demand and consumption. It was building internal supply chains as opposed to global supply chains. It was moving up the ladder of production, so intermediate goods were an increasing portion of its exports. And of course, it was climbing the technological ladder. Also, we saw that supply chains around the world were less reliant on the labor cost arbitrage. This meant that the importance of knowledge-intensive industries increased, and there was more reliance on skilled labor working with digital platforms. Then there are the effects of technology shifts, which we're just still starting to encounter. For example, one that people are watching is 3D printing. As many of you will know, the trading system from the 1990s on depended on large batches, specialized components that were assembled over very distant areas. But 3D printing creates the opportunity to move to small batches, customized products on site with the purchaser. Though the effects are a little unclear. So the Peterson Institute of International Economics in Washington did a study of one of the early 3D production items, which was for hearing aids. And interestingly enough, The effect was basically to strengthen the position of the three primary producers, which I think were Singapore, Denmark, and Switzerland. And in part because the quality improved, the costs came down, so trade actually increased. But hearing aids are small components, so people expect that with larger types of equipment, the 3D printing might change the trading pattern. There was also, importantly, and unfortunately in my view, a breakdown in what I'll refer to as global governance for trade. Not that there's one controlling system, but in general, in the past, the United States played a role of trying to push for new rules because the US economy was more cutting edge. So whether it was the service industry or intellectual property rights or data issues, usually US negotiators are trying to push for rules that would apply across countries. The Trump administration has largely abandoned that. They focus more on what economists call managed trade, as you saw with their phase 1 deal with China, sort of overall purchases. So second point, what are the effects of the COVID virus? Well, as I'm sure all of you encountered, it's been a very harsh economic effect on both the supply and the demand side because of lockdowns. So on the demand side, you have the fall off because of industry and income and unemployment, but you also have disruptions on the supply side. And then on top of that, the normal links of transport and travel for people have been disrupted, so supply chains have been distorted. In addition, in some of the most basic activities, such as medical supplies and food, you've seen export restrictions. We have huge state interventions for governments that have the money, which can be distorting. In some regions, you've had a problem with trade finance, as one did in the global financial crisis of 2008. And then, of course, you're seeing the initial adaptations. So, for example, companies and countries are looking for more diversity in sourcing, not relying on sort of one producer country. They have to think more about stockpiles and inventories, even though they're more costly. There's a move to the digital businesses. There are new opportunities and services shifts, for example, in telemedicine. And then part of the big story is the decoupling of the US-China trade relationship. Still very big, very active, but particularly in the technology space, they're starting to turn away from one another. So third, what would be some of my expectations in the medium term that many of you in your countries might deal with? Well, first, expect a rise to what I'll call precautionism as opposed to protectionism. And this is the idea that governments have to take steps to protect societies against risks. You'll see this especially in health and environment, but if the pattern from the past holds, it'll spread to other areas. You'll see this in safety regulations or standards or certifications or licensing requirements or even border and marketing controls. And of course, some producers will use the notion of precautionism to lead to new protectionism so as to stop competition. And particularly for emerging market economies like many of yours, this could be a particularly difficult challenge to deal with. One will also see more screening in the investment area, and in cross-border investment is very important, not only in capital, but often in know-how and connection with other economies. You'll see pressure on supply chains, especially with China. You hear discussions of people referring more to strategic autonomy, so less dependent on the international system, efforts to reshore manufacturing or other activities. But there'll be some stickiness in this because it will be costly to disrupt the supply chains. Then you're going to have the technological alternatives. As Sarah alluded, I serve on some company boards. One of them I serve on is Twitter. And many of you read about the discussions about content and moderation of content. Well, much of those activities for Twitter had been done with the work staff in the Philippines. Well, with coronavirus, many of that staff had to go home. A lot of them would not be able to participate. So you start to see a shift to relying more on artificial intelligence. So you're relying on machines to be able to do at least some of the sifting. You'll see this across many areas. And indeed, from my familiarity with digital companies in the United States, they're not taking the setback of the coronavirus as a permanent condition. They're looking at it as an opportunity to strengthen their position. So one of the outcomes might be that the strong get stronger. And for those of you that work in financial markets, you can see this in terms of the values of technology stocks in the United States. Then there will be other issues that will complicate it. For example, there's now a rising challenge about international tax policies driven by EU wanting to tax digital companies, even though they may not have particular operations, physical operations in the locations. You're going to see an increasing debate about carbon border taxes. The EC has talked about this, the European Commission. If you have a change of government in the United States, I think you'll see more of this in the US, because as countries figure out how to impose a price on carbon, various taxes, well, then they have to be careful about the imports from other countries that don't necessarily include that cost. And I mentioned technology companies. You're going to see a revival of antitrust and competition policies. So fourth, a few policy questions for your group to think about. One is finding the balance between national resilience and global resilience. Now, these might seem similar, but actually an insistence on the former, national resilience, will actually hurt the latter because you no longer have the adaptability across borders. You'll hear this discussed somewhat as whether countries are trying to adapt to the different issues such as safety in pandemic, or whether they're trying to seek autarky, trying to cut themselves off. Two, a debate about managed trade versus more open trade. I've alluded to this before with the Trump administration. The Trump administration is focused on bilateral trade deficits, and therefore, in its deals, it's trying to focus on managing the outcomes as opposed to expanding the rules for competition. And this will undoubtedly spread to other countries as well. Three, who will set the rules? So here, let's take a moment to look about China. I refer to China as pursuing globalization with Chinese characteristics. And what I mean by that is that China is following a two-track policy. On the one hand, China is part of international institutions, the WTO, World Bank, IMF, WHO, ITU for communications, and not surprisingly, it's trying to press its interests or norms within those existing institutions. This isn't really a surprise for countries to do. What's been more of a surprise is that the US has actually pulled back from a number of these institutions, in my view, mistakenly leaving the field open for China and others, although now you see the United States trying to push its way back, but I'm not sure in a constructive fashion. But there's a second track to Chinese policy, and it's what I refer to as the tributary state model, which goes back to the Chinese dynasties many millennia. And the notion is that countries can have good economic and political relations with Beijing as long, and they'll get benefits as long as they behave well, treat Beijing with respect, and certainly don't challenge the role of the Communist Party. So in your region, the Belt and Road is clearly an example of this. The potential infrastructure-led development, but raising issues of debt and other questions that will, I think, create tensions for China going forward. Four, there will be costs of these investment controls. Everybody can always argue the national security limits on investment, but if you limit investment, you're going to hurt the process of development. Fifth, I believe there'll be dangers of anti-immigration policies. If you look at US innovation, entrepreneurship, the tech sector, large percentage of the people who help create industries and businesses in the United States are either immigrants or children of immigrants, and so I think that will have a cost. Sixth, and this is something that really relates to all of your countries as well, is it's important to try to recognize the interconnections. So, for example, if the European Union is unsuccessful in helping sub-Saharan Africa with development, some of the problems, for example, of migration will not go away. So you either develop and deal with the population boom in sub-Saharan Africa, create opportunities there, or likely people will come. So in sum, your meeting and your careers will be at a time where the trade and international economic system is in considerable flux. It's a system that evolved out of World War II. After the Cold War, it went through various adaptations, many changes. But over some 70 years, there was a basic security, political, and economic structure. And frankly, that is more fragile now. In some ways, it's fragmenting. And so you face a world where, whether it's security, politics, or economics, you are in an edge of what could be significant changes. I personally believe that COVID-19 is likely to accelerate those trends and add to more barriers and frictions. And that will be challenging for all countries, including those of Central Asia and Afghanistan. So let me stop at that, Sarah, and then why don't we take people's questions?
All right, then. Thank you very much, Bob. So we'll now open up to questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to chat them through via Zoom. We did collect a few questions in advance, so I'll start off with some of those. One question was with regards to the issue of unemployment in the region, and that continues to be a major issue for many of the countries. And the question was, if you think the donor community really understands how to boost economic development that can generate employment in these countries.
So it would help, Sarah, if not for this question, for others, if you could give me maybe the name of the person who asked and where they're from.
Sure, this came from Mamuka, who is from Georgia originally.
Okay. So in some ways, this involves the whole question of what we've learned of development policies. And yes, people are well aware of the risks of unemployment in various ways. It leads to social stability. It's a lack of tapping the opportunities of your whole population. When I was at the World Bank, I tried to also focus on some of the gender dimensions of this, made the simple point that if you take 50% of your population and put them to the side, it's not going to help your own sort of development and growth. As for the methods, there are many different approaches. It starts, and Georgia is a good example of this, you need to have basic macroeconomic stability. So that's your budget, your fiscal, your monetary policies, so as to create an environment where people have enough confidence to sort of invest and create jobs. And then there are various workforce policies, and this starts with everything from education to skills training to adaptability. Now, frankly, no one has this exactly right. I mean, part of the challenges you see in the United States are at a time where you have transformations because of international trade or technology, some of the workforce was left behind, and particularly for older populations, it's harder to make those moves. Then that brings you to the question of what sort of safety net policies do you want to have? And this is, of course, a question of spending, but also a question of incentives. So, for example, when I was at the World Bank, we picked up on a program that the then Mexican government had done for sort of the bottom 15% called Oportunidades, opportunity. And it was based on the idea of having cash transfers actually to the women head of households if the children went to school and the kids got medical checkups. It probably did more for women's health in Mexico than anything in the history of the country. It was a very efficient program, and it was sort of connecting safety net with development policies. So I'm touching on these because there's really no one silver bullet. It has to connect across the whole aspect of a healthy economy. And obviously what I'm also suggesting today is that particularly for smaller economies, it depends on how you fit into the international economic system. Georgia for many years was kind of a star. It used the World Bank standards for doing business to try to increase investment. But obviously security issues in Georgia create different problems. Another big issue that would be a matter for all the countries in the region is corruption. Corruption is a tax, corruption creates uncertainty, corruption removes opportunity, and that's where the basic fundamentals of rule of law, transparency, basic property rights those are the fundamental for any growth strategy, including employment.
Great. Our next question is actually also from a friend from Georgia. This is from Rusidon from Georgia. And she is asking, how do you see tourism as a possibility of economic recovery in the region?
Well, I think it's going to be very difficult until you get a vaccine. Anybody can make their guess on the timing we take for effective vaccines and the treatment as well. And kind of, we don't know how long a vaccine will work or immunities. But you've seen the fall off in transport. You've seen devastation across tourism industries. You've seen some modest revivals within economies as they start. You're seeing this in Europe, for example. But my caution is, I think we've moved from a phase where many countries had lockdowns to try to deal with the surge of COVID infected people and the overload of the healthcare system. But then inevitably, this created a problem economically, and frankly, people got weary of being locked down. So then you've had a reopening. And I think we're going to be in a phase now where I would expect that you're going to see spikes. You'll see spikes in certain regions, certain hotspots. Kind of what countries have learned is it's best to have good testing and tracing and sort of rapid response. But frankly, countries have done varying jobs of this. In South Korea, it's been quite effective. Singapore did well. It had an outbreak among some of its sort of outside worker community. I'm afraid the US has not used the time well. And so you can see in our daily news that people are tired of being locked up. They want to get out, particularly younger people who also are vulnerable but are less vulnerable. And so I'm afraid that until you get a vaccine, this is going to be an ongoing plague.
Our next question comes from Afghanistan, from Shoaib. And he writes, Afghanistan's level of donor dependency is higher than your usual developing country, and we are already dealing with donor fatigue up until the COVID-19 pandemic. How do you think COVID-19 will affect donor fatigue generally and specifically for Afghanistan? Any possible analysis on COVID-19's impact on Afghanistan's peace process will also be appreciated.
So, as you would expect, it's a reality, although a harsh one, that COVID-19 has put strains on the normal donor governments. Their budgets are under stress. Their societies are under stress. They're trying to figure out how to overcome some of the immediate issues. And inevitably, what that means is they get distracted. Now, in the US, you have another set of issues related to George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, over time, these might create healthy adjustments. One of the things that many people around the world often, I think, don't recognize, but open societies will have these types of dramatic events because they're the way that they identify problems and, I hope, deal with them. The record is that they normally never deal with them 100%, but they tend to make progress over time, but it depends on the nature of the political system. But all this means that the traditional challenges of development, then on top of that, pandemic conditions in developing countries, there will be voices, there's attention to it, but I think it puts an even greater requirement on the local countries to, in a sense, earn the favor and support. So the IMF, for example, and the World Bank are trying to help some of the poorest developing countries with their debt issues. They're also trying to offer some financial support. You will continue from Europe and USAID and others to get that sort of financial support. But to use it effectively and to sustain it, people tend to respond best to those that look like they're helping themselves. And this is one of the challenges for Afghanistan, because for reasons that you know much better than I, outsiders look and they see the divisions. They see the divisions within the government. They see the difference between the government and the Taliban. And from an American perspective, this has been a very long conflict. My own sense, I don't necessarily agree with this policy, but I think I'm giving you my best estimate, is that President Trump wants out. And I think Khalilzad's mission has been basically to negotiate the best deal that he can as he exits. You know, when you look at President Trump's policies from the start, he was an outlier. He was he wanted to disrupt the system. He wanted to be different than his predecessors. And there are a few issues that are symbolically important to that: anti-immigration, wall of Mexico, protectionism, and I think withdrawing from foreign conflicts. So whether it was Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, even pulling troops out of Germany, this is kind of symptomatic of how he conveys his authenticity to the American people. Now, in many of those cases, there'll be different voices in the United States, so that's part of the debate. But for Afghanistan in particular, without trying to oversimplify it, the more that the competing factions in the government and society can stand together, develop a common approach, deal with some of the underlying problems, whether they be development or whether they be corruption, that will build more support. There are still people who understand what's been done for women and girls in schools and different healthcare systems and more open society. They would prefer not to lose it. But the question is, under pressure, depending on what the pictures and the stories they see of Afghanistan, whether they will sustain that effort. You know, when I was at the World Bank, I left in 2012, but I was working with the Obama administration. I did some economic work that focused on the budget, and I was trying to get a sense of where the revenues came from for Afghanistan. And one of the realities, as you point out, is very aid dependent. And so I was trying to at least get people to reconcile the size of the Afghan army that they wanted to have with who were the revenue sources and who was going to pay for it. And so these are the realities that people will have to confront. So, you know, it's one of the frustrating things, and I'm sure it must be for people in Afghanistan, is been terrible decades of tragedy, but there's also been a lot accomplished, and life is very different. And so it would be a shame to see that set back, but ultimately, whether it's politics, history, economics, whether for my country or yours, it depends on the people at home and what they're willing to do and what they're willing to fight for.
Thank you. All right, we got a bunch coming in now. This one comes from one of our fellows in Mongolia, St. Tolga, and he is asking, how does the overcapacity of the logistics and travel industries as a result of COVID-19 going to affect the cost and efficiencies of those said industries? Is the world going to let all those capacities sit idly?
Well, this partly raised, I mean, the question itself recognizes that you're going to have big collapses in some of the demand. But remember, I also said that it was a supply side shock. And what I meant by that was, for example, you have disruptions in the shipping industry or the air industry. And so some of the capacity, even though you would expect that you would have extra capacity, in supply and logistics chains, they can get broken. And just as I also mentioned in trade finance, in 2008 and 2009, when I was at the World Bank and the banking supervisors tried to restore the capital and the safety and soundness of many of the Western banks, they wanted them to require to build their capital up, be more sensitive to the risks of their loans. And inadvertently, they almost cut off trade finance to many developing countries, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, because they were raising the risk quotient, the amount of capital that have to be held. So you were having a negative multiplier effect. So fortunately, the head of the WTO, my friend Pascal Lamy, and I brought this to the attention of the banking regulators. So what your question really raises is you're going to have a lot of ripple effects. And that's what I was trying to touch on. You're going to have ripple effects of technology, but you also have to account for what was already happening in the trading system. And obviously in Central Asia, the role of China, China's plans, the development, these are going to be very significant in terms of kind of different patterns that change. Now, in the case of Mongolia, I know there's always been a challenge in terms of some of the copper resources and the mineral companies. Copper prices collapsed with a lot of the market, but you could see as they have some potential to come back as people need them for different batteries and you get various recovery. So frankly, without knowing the specifics, I think it's important for Mongolia to try to work with some of the international companies there that realize they have a long-term investment and they have common interests. Of course, for Mongolia, the other problem was that if you rely on major commodities like copper, that may not employ as many people. So then you had the question of some of the other related industries and some of the social effects of the transformation of the society. So those have to be customized in each country and each circumstance. And for example, when you asked about the capacity on the transport, in some cases, I think countries and companies will have to customize solutions. You can imagine things being cut off, and therefore it'll be important that the business and the public policy sectors work together to try to identify those risks and at least come with some at least patch, if not a total fix.
Next question comes from Jenny in Kyrgyzstan. And Jenny's question is, in this global pandemic, do you consider that countries are getting to coordinate more closely, or are we facing deglobalization? Taking the example of the vaccine, is the US working with China on research and development? Going further, what is your version of the new world order in terms of global cooperation?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And there's really no simple answer to it. And what I'd offer these thoughts. The factors that have driven globalization are not going away. So the pandemic is a good example, or issues of climate and environment. So sometimes people refer to these as global or transnational issues. Information flows, capital flows, the global economy in general, those are going to remain factors. So I don't think you can shut off globalization. What you can do, and what we're seeing, is you can fragment the system. And it's my point about autarky versus adaptation and whether you have national resilience versus global resilience. And those can add costs while they try to deal with countries' perceived sense of their own protection. So striking that balance will be one of the big issues you're going to see over the course of the next 5 years, and will affect your professional lifetimes considerably. Now, particularly on the medicines and health issue, what's quite interesting is the rhetoric between the United States and China has obviously worsened a lot. And there's various reasons for this. I'm more in a minority. I think that this is a mistake, because I think that their record is, even though we have differences with China, there are many areas where we have mutuality, and the record can show the possibilities of cooperation while recognizing the competition and different ideologies of the system. But interestingly, while you have that at the government level, from what I've been able to ascertain, many in the medical and scientific community are continuing to share information, and whether it's studies, whether it's, and there's problems about what information has totally been available. But I was on a video conference last week with one of the major international figures, and the contacts that he has with his Chinese colleagues are sort of quite significant. You asked particularly what will happen with vaccines. I think that's very unclear. I think there's a global pressure that says, look, we have to try to deal with this in a global dimension. So that would mean focusing first on vulnerable groups, healthcare workers, elderly, other populations. But I think the to be frank with you, I think you'll see countries trying to protect their publics first. And this is why in the case of the US and Europe, you've seen, and China, big investments in multiple vaccine research, and also simultaneously investments in the types of facilities that could do the production quite quickly. So part of the issue is not just finding the vaccine, but how you ramp up the production. One interesting aspect of the world today is this is no longer something just of governments. So the Gates Foundation is one of the biggest funders of this. And Bill Gates, I think, personally tried to invest in 8 or 9 different production facilities preparing for different vaccines. And the good news for poor countries such as Kyrgyzstan is that Gates and others will keep their eye and focus on trying to make these supplies available and kind of lessons learned about how to use it most effectively. I wish that there were better cooperation of the governments. When you started your question, it reminded me of the contrast I felt in the global financial crisis. So I was at the World Bank from 2007 to 12. We had food price crisis. We had obviously development crisis. Sad to say, the degree of cooperation among the G20 countries was much better than today. It wasn't perfect, but it certainly made a difference in terms of global response on the big issues like stimulus programs, but also on the small ones, as I mentioned, like dealing with trade finance. Having said that, while the capitals are not cooperating as I wish they would, there's a lot of cooperation going on sort of below the scenes. So for some of you that deal with financial markets, you'll be aware the US Federal Reserve activated dollar swap lines and also created various repo facilities for other developing countries because there was a fear of dollar shortages. That was a good policy. It's sort of under the radar screen. Frankly, even Europe would have been in a bad way without it. I mentioned the Gates Foundation and various scientific groups. So fortunately, there is cooperation going on, not enough. In the case of Kyrgyzstan, obviously, if I recall, a large portion of your labor force works in Russia. So you're very dependent on the payments of workers. So if unemployment is in Russia as well as health problems, that's going to rebound back to your economies as well as some of the others in Central Asia. That just shows the interconnections here. I remember raising this point with Prime Minister Medvedev and your economies in the course of 2010, 2009 because of the large importance of the expatriate worker community and the remittances. But I don't know whether people are doing that today. I suspect not to the same degree.
All right, now we have a question from Gohar in Kazakhstan. And her question is, currently in the region, there is a gap between the education that is offered and the needs of the economies. Lack of professionals for the digital economy, transportation and logistics and agriculture. How can that gap in human capital development be closed in the shortest time?
Well, it's interesting hearing that from Kazakhstan, because I think one of the things that, and again, I'm a few years out of touch on this, but actually that impressed me about the Kazakh policies over past decades was that the investment the government was making in higher education, including sending people overseas. And I could see it even during my time that people who would be in the public sector as vice ministers or directors general or others, you could see the effect of the investment in the future. I thought that was a very smart thing. Now, I don't know the degree to which Kazakhstan has been able to continue that. And your question obviously goes to a broader issue about skills, not just at sort of at the top level. All I can say is that at the heart of all our economies are people. Economists refer to it as human capital, but it's people. And how you give people an opportunity to reach their potential, work with others, men and women, that's going to be the best investment in the future. And it starts with obviously basic health and infant mortality and child conditions. So I'm afraid this is not something that gets turned around overnight, but I guess my answer would be, for Kazakhstan and other governments to try to learn what has worked most effectively around the world. This is where the World Bank programs and others that I mentioned can be helpful, because you have limited resources. So what has been most efficient? I will also mention, as we've discussed in the past, this is where the private sector is important. I mean, even take a case of the United States, a lot of the best training occurs with the private sector firms. And so if government policies just focus on trying to train people in the public sector, disconnected from the private sector needs, it often falters. So you need to try to create some partnerships. In the United States, this was done partly also through community colleges. So the 2-year colleges where you could get the local businesses and others to get a sense of what would be the needs going forward in the skilled labor force or employment force, trying to have the training, whether it be healthcare workers or others. In Germany, there's more of an apprentice system. So there's different models out there. And there's always a challenge too, which is trying to supply people with the skills and knowledge for today's business, but at the same time, you need to help them adapt for the future. For a number of years, I've been supporting an effort in Rwanda called Aquila, which has started out with girls and women's education after the genocide, and it started out getting them into working with Marriott and other international hotels, but it's expanded, including with the information services area and the technology point of view. So this, I think, is a question that each government has to think about the long-range potential of its people, but at the same time, there are lessons out there about sort of what has worked most effectively.
Thank you. Next, we have a question from Azerbaijan, from Samir. And his question is, how, if at all, will a possible change from a Republican to liberal government affect the U.S. position on international trade and impact it outside of U.S. world trade relations, especially in the realm of the post-COVID recovery phase?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And to be frank, no one really knows the answer. And let me explain why. Before Trump, the Republican Party traditionally was more supportive of trade. It believed more in open markets. It supported the free trade agreements. This was part of its links to the business community. And the Democratic Party's key constituency, particularly the unions, was more hostile to trade. Now, what you've seen in polling numbers, for example, some of the work done by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, shows that that has shifted. The Democratic voters are now more supportive of trade than Republican voters. But I think that's partly because, and there's a logic in that the Democratic Party is getting more young people. You would think young people would be more alert to the global interconnections. But I think some of that reflects antipathy towards Trump. So they're for trade because Trump is against trade. And the challenge in trade politics is always that the general public tends to be supportive of it because it seems to have ties to the world, more choice, lower cost, better quality. But those interests that are that perceive threats become more organized and focused on them. So I think that a President Biden will want to look more multilateral than Trump, but it's a little fuzzy of what that would mean in various areas and how he would do it and bring his constituencies along. You, I think, focus on a key dimension, which is, as I've alluded to, I don't think we're going to get back to more normal circumstances until we get a vaccine or at least serious treatment. But at that point, we're still going to have a long way to climb in terms of economic development and recovery. And as my comments suggested, we put in a lot of barriers that are going to make that more costly. So you could make an argument that the Biden administration would recognize some of the economic costs of this and that would want to try to remove them. However, they're going to have their hands full. I mean, look at what the news you see coming out of the United States about cities and African Americans. They're going to want to focus on climate change. They have a set of other sense of redistribution issues. So one of the challenges in the US system, or frankly, any democratic system, is you can't do everything. What are your priorities? On the trade topic, I'm somewhat worried that a Biden administration will want to be less adversarial. They'll want to move away from some of the destructive things Trump has done. How much capital, political capital, they put into kind of reforming and making it better, those are question marks. I'll give you two thoughts, though, in particular. In discussions with Europeans and some Asians, Australians, I've suggested that this is somewhat fluid. And so, frankly, the effect of other countries in terms of saying how there could be win-win opportunities, explaining how one could deal with some of the political challenges, but also make advances internationally, that might be influential because these ideas are forming. And also, I think my own guess is there'll be a greater need to connect trade with the environment. So if you think about Democratic policy constituencies, climate and environment, and again, there's, as opposed to being in conflict, obviously you're going to have a hard time dealing with the environment unless you have satisfactory growth. The growth is not going to be sustainable unless you deal with some of the environmental conditions. The two can be put together. I started negotiating free trade agreements for the United States in 2001 that for the first time had environmental provisions. So they just said that countries shouldn't violate the international agreements they've had. As I've alluded to, I suspect you're going to see more of this on the carbon border tax issue, how you can reconcile that. Now that can be frustrating for some developing countries because they may feel they can't meet the same sort of carbon standards. But so if I were advising people how to approach this from a Democratic administration, I try to think how you could support open markets, but also in a way that dealt with climate and environmental issues more effectively. And let me give you one other example that's sort of striking. Most people haven't paid attention to it though, and that I've been very interested in wildlife issues. So I was part of a group to try to save at that time, about 3,400 tigers left in the wild. The numbers are now up to about 3,900 because they could have been exterminated even in my lifetime, much less yours. If you think about the nature of this pandemic, think about the connections with wildlife and wildlife markets. One of the virus experts I spoke to last week said, you know, every year there's about 5 new major viruses that come up. And the question is, what will be their scope, how effective they are. And about 3 of them are wildlife related. The others are often related to sort of problems on bacteria and others. And so, frankly, you know, the inability, the illegal wildlife trafficking, the use of some of these, the wildlife markets as part of international trade, I mean, it's not only bad for environmental conservation, it's bad for health. In the news today, you'll see there's new outbreaks in Beijing, and these come from sort of wet markets where, again, some of these wildlife are out there. So this is where, in thinking about the pandemic, I think it's important not to just think about it today. I think it's important to consider it as a future question of biological security. And by the way, where I believe important investments in biotechnology, as well as other issues, whether they be environment and energy or digital and cyber security. You're going to see the security agenda shift somewhat from the traditional one to these so-called new topics, even though in many ways they've been with us all our lifetime.
Thank you. Next, this is a question from Talant from Kyrgyzstan, and he says, as someone involved in academia now, what do you see as the future of education post-COVID, both higher and primary? Will it be back to normal, or would it have to evolve significantly?
Well, I would be presumptuous to say I'm really involved with education. I have a fellow's position. I'm writing a book, and as Sarah mentioned, will come out in August. But as I've written that, I've taken part in a seminar up at Harvard, and with some real faculty. But I've learned the difference between people who they're professional scholars and amateurs like me. But having said that, I also used to be on the board of an education company, and so I see some ties in this area. And I think you're going to see, in some ways, a near-term issue, which is how safe is it to open classrooms? And you'll see the pressure, particularly for younger populations, to reopen. But you're going to have challenges there because these are closed, confined spaces, and what we've learned about social distancing and other questions, how effective it will be. I think over the longer term, you'll see an acceleration. This is one of my themes of trends you already saw, which is the use of digital learning. Now, what I was discovering before the coronavirus is that online learning alone had limits. You started to see more hybrid approaches. So you would combine some classrooms with online learning. You allow people to move at their own pace or catch up on different classes and lectures. We're learning about kind of people's need to have the physical and personal contact and other issues. But I think there's also big efficiencies here. And going back to the questions that some of you have asked about workforce training and others, I think there are ways to use some of these newer tools to help people with skills development. But I think it's going to be an acceleration of the adaptive processes that you've already seen. It's also a cost factor, and it's also a learning factor. From some of the faculty that I've spoken to, you know, they've had to adapt to how they actually run their classes online, and it's a different set of skills, set of interaction. But I think this is an inevitable process, and it can be very helpful for countries and economies such as yours with disparate populations. And the real question, of course, then is, can you get the effective IT backbones as well?
Thank you. This is a broad reaching question, but this is from Farouk in Tajikistan, and he's asking, how would you assess the future role and shape of international organizations such as the World Health Organization, World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and so on?
Well, it's another very good question. And the main point, let me give you a couple of fundamental points that apply to all of them. Each of them is different, so there's no one model. And when you study them, it's important to look at their histories and the institutional nature. So let's take the WHO, which has been under some criticism. I worked closely with the WHO when I was at the World Bank. Its international charter is, of course, determined by the member states. So there's a certain hypocrisy here when the countries attack the WHO, because they're the ones that determine the scope of the WHO. And the WHO tended to have rather modest authority to coordinate. It certainly didn't have enforcement power, certainly didn't have power to investigate. It needed the countries to be willing to work with it. It built capacity in part, the Gates Foundation, I think, is the second largest funder, that would help some of the developing countries have access to knowledge and resources. It had a field staff, but it was a much thinner field staff than, say, UNICEF or World Food Program or others, so each varies. Now, interestingly, something you never see discussed is that about 10 years ago, the head of the WHO was a former, I think, Norwegian prime minister named Gro Brundtland. She thought that the WHO ought to have more authority, and she pushed, and she kind of wanted to be able to give it a greater reach within countries. Well, guess what happened? None of the capitals liked that idea because they didn't want to yield their position of authority. So the reality is, in these jobs, when you're the leader, you have to figure out how to maintain support, how to get resources, but also to be effective. And here's where I think the Director General of the WHO had a very difficult job, but where he may have made a slight mistake. In his effort early on to build support with China and to get information from China, he probably leaned a little too far forward in saying, oh, everything is great, they're doing a super job, because clearly there were problems and some of the information didn't come up. I understand how this happened. I don't mean to be critical, but you have to be careful about your credibility. So just to give you an analogy, when I was at the World Bank, obviously I'm an American. I was supported by all the countries, but I was nominated by the United States. Now and then I kind of differentiated my position from the US position, whether it was the Bush administration or the Obama administration. Now, interestingly enough, I could do that because I had some feel there were different groups within the U.S. system. So I had support in the Congress, even where it was different from the administration. I had support from various outside groups. I didn't go out looking to pick fights, but now and then I made sure that it was clear that I brought an independent position. Similarly, I had to build various allies and partnerships. Just to give you a small example you wouldn't think about, the Nordics are very big contributors to the world development side. They put a lot of money and effort into it. They're smaller countries. When it came time for positions on our board, the Nordics have always had one board seat. They were worried because there was an effort to get rid of so many Europeans on the board, they'd be squeezed out. Well, I was very careful to make sure they kept their board seat. And each year I would have a separate meeting with the Nordic ministers to sort of talk about their agenda. So if you think about it in your own, for those of you in the policy world or business world, it's constituencies, it's stakeholder management. And when you run one of these institutions, you can't be at war with everybody. But on the other hand, if you look like you're controlled by people, you're also going to lose credibility. So it's interesting when people think about these jobs, they often think about, who's the world expert in X or Y or Z or something. To be honest, a lot of these jobs are trying to exercise executive skill with diplomacy, with fundraising, and of course, obviously working with your staff to help them sort of develop the most that they can. And again, to emphasize that, just to give you a small feel, when I was at the World Bank, I appointed the first chief economist from the developing world, who was Chinese. Well, that wasn't accidental. I wanted to send a signal. Of my senior team of about maybe 35 or 40 people, I had over half women and over half from developing countries. That was, to be honest, at the level, a couple levels below, it was only 35% from developing countries or women. So that took a real effort. So to make these changes, there's different things you have to do. You have to realize that sometimes the DNA replicates itself, so you have to kind of push the borders. But when you do that, you also have to recognize at times it's not going to work. So now and then, if I kind of advanced people, woman or developing world person, and it didn't fit, you also had to help them and be able to realize, to coach and mentor them. And then if it didn't work out, to kind of deal with the exit in a humane way. So these are all kind of, when you read the news stories, it's kind of black and white. As much of life, it tends to be a little bit more gray and complex.
Thank you. All right, we have time for maybe just one or two more questions. So let's see, we have one here from Rahim in Kazakhstan. He says, the economist Nouriel Roubini, known for accurately predicting the previous world crisis, in his recent interviews assesses the current situation as the beginning of the very Great Depression caused by the coronavirus pandemic. Do you agree with such an assessment, and how can post-Soviet countries mitigate the consequences and prepare for the future?
Actually, one of the nice things about the world today is you got access now to more resources through the internet than people certainly would have in your region even 20 years ago. And I cite that because the Financial Times, which is a global paper but published in London, asked me and 4 or 5 other people about a week ago to write 400 words. You only had 400 words about whether there'll be another Great Depression. I said no, but I said I expect a fumbling fragmentation for the reasons that I mentioned. And I took it then I moved to the geopolitical topics. But on the plus side, you've seen some very sort of aggressive fiscal and monetary responses in the US, Europe, and in different ways with China. That, I think, is going to help the world economy stabilize. The Great Depression was so damaging because, not just because of the initial fall, but because of that it extended over the course of a decade. I think we've learned enough about the macroeconomic issues to avoid that. But as I suggested in that piece, I expect the recovery to be somewhat slower. People use the swoosh, the Nike swoosh. I think it's more of that nature, as opposed to a V-shaped recovery that you saw in some financial markets expectation. And I also think that you're going to have these shocks. It'll be ups and downs and the volatility in the process. And the types of things we've talked about today on the trade side or geopolitics, those can add costs and those can add sort of frictions and tensions in the process. But I don't see the type of global breakdown that you had in the 1930s. But this is also where the term that scholars use is agency. What that means is the decisions that people and countries make matter. The governments can make this a lot worse if they add to barriers. And I think the timing of the recovery, as we've said a couple times here, really depends on the development of the vaccines and the spread of the vaccines. And I'm an optimist by nature, so I think that, that's something that will come over the course of the next year. How quickly, I can't predict, but that's different than a decade.
Okay, so I'm going to close it out with one last question from me. And that is if you would share a little bit more about your upcoming book and what it's about, the premise of it, and then as it focuses on US policy, I think you said over the last 200 years, I know our fellows and the people from the region are always curious about kind of what can we expect as far as US engagement with the region, and how much is the US going to pay attention or not pay attention to their countries, especially given everything else going on. So along with commenting and providing a little bit of flavor on your book, if you could maybe close it out by sharing your thoughts as far as what you think people from the region can expect as far as US engagement with their countries in the period ahead.
Well, that's wonderful, because authors always like to talk about their books. And going back to the question about skills in activism and advocacy, I suggested to Sarah that they buy each of you a copy of the book so you can urge her to follow through on it so you can read it yourself. But let me tell you what about the book first. Henry Kissinger wrote a book about 20 years ago called Diplomacy, and he used history to talk about diplomacy and international relations. But given his background, he relies very heavily on the European experience and outlook. So for decades, I've been trying to think about how to write something that would talk about the American experience, but I wanted it available for a more general audience. So my style is to use stories. So each chapter is a story. So it's a bit of a mini biography about a person or a couple people and particular problems that they dealt with. And in the process of discussing the particular problems, I make some assessment and I share some insights on diplomacy. But I select them so as to emphasize different ideas and themes that have affected US diplomacy over the course of 200 years. So as Sarah mentioned, the opening is actually Ben Franklin in Paris during our revolution. So, and then it runs from there. The last formal chapter goes up to President Bush 41 instead of events in '89. But I have an afterword that focused on the four sort of presidents after that, because my colleagues in the seminar said, look, you can't end there, you have to go forward. But I use some traditions. I draw sort of 5 traditions that are different than some of the other ones people use. One is the focus on North America in the past and today. One is on trade and transnationalism technology, and others on alliances. Another is public support, including through the Congress. And another one is kind of America's purpose, which I believe changes over the decades, but it's always a key part of the foreign policy. So I try to have good color in it as well to entertain people. But just to give you an example for people who know a little bit about US history, we had a very violent, traumatic civil war in 1861 to 1865. The bookshelves right next to me here are overloaded with books on battles and leaders and even social effects. Very few discuss the foreign policy of the Civil War, where Britain almost intervened and France almost intervened. So I talk about some of the incidents that drove that. Now, to apply this to more broadly to Central Asia and Afghanistan, one of the themes I have in the book on the alliances and others was the creation of a system after World War II of an alliance network and a security, economic, and political network which was, of course, adapted at the end of the Cold War. That 70, 80-year-old system was always in flux, as we talked about with trade. But I think it's now under severe stress, in part because of changes, in part because of Trump administration policies. I don't think it'll go back to what it was in the past. The question is kind of what variations, as some of your questions asked. But my book, but also the reality is you can't look at these things in isolation. So the rise of China, breakup of the Soviet Union, changes in European Union, these are rise of India, these are all significant elements. So we could be entering an age here where the Eurasian landmass, which is always dominant in terms of world affairs, assumes an increase in importance, but in a different way. So what we've been talking about transportation corridors and movement of people, from China to Central Asia to Europe, and going back to Marco Polo or sort of other developments in Central Asia, the Silk Roads, you could be returning to a different type of interconnectivity across Eurasia. This raises issues for everybody. It raises issues for the countries on the periphery of Japan. Kissinger says, will Europe develop its own strategic perspective or become an appendage of the geopolitics of Eurasia? And so in that sense, the world of Central Asia and your economies is going to be perhaps more at the heart of activities than it had been for centuries. But the choices, the effects, the interactions of powers, global issues, transnational relations, those are very much in flux. So I would just say that from a US point of view, there's attention to sort of China's growing influence in the region, but China has geographic propinquity, Belt and Road issues. Clearly, India is going to be very significant, and that's a question of India's success and sort of how it engages, how Europe works back, of course, sort of Russia's anxieties. And the US recognizes it's not on the scene and directly in those areas. It doesn't have the geographic closeness, but it has interests with all those parties. And frankly, I think by nature of this point about America's purpose, it will lean forward and wish well for countries that move towards more open political systems or open economic systems, whether it's by business issues or sort of notions of sort of social networks. I think, as one of your earlier questions suggested, a lot will depend on kind of perceptions of how countries are doing for themselves. And I know this is not easy, but some of the enthusiasms of 2000 have waned. You've had 20 years of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. You've seen the effects of that in terms of public support. On the other hand, when the US pulls out and you see an ISIS or an Al-Qaeda, others sort of rise, you realize that you can't escape some of these questions. We talked about this with Afghanistan on the question there. And so I think that diplomatically, your countries are going to have to be agile in that they can't ignore China, but they would be best if they can maintain multiplicity of relations. We had some questions of Kazakhstan. I think Kazakhstan has tried to do this with its relations with Russia and China, as well as the United States and Europe. This won't be easy in terms of positioning. And now and then we'll have to kind of accommodate some of the big power pressures of this environment. But I think the best formula is, as your questions also went to, is your resilience at home. If you take care of your people, if you've got opportunity, if you got growth, if you become deal with the sort of the fulfillment of the skills and opportunities of your own people, you're going to be a stronger sort of country or economy. I work a lot with Singapore. I serve on the board of Temasek, the sovereign wealth fund there. I work with them on trade and economic issues. Singapore is only 4 or 5 million people, but they managed to also recognize their hardened sort of a trading and economic system, and they leverage their strengths quite effectively in the system. They try to be friendly and cooperative with others, but they also try to be firm on some of their basic set of security questions. Obviously, it's different if you're an island, small island country than if you're a big continental country, as some of you, or landlocked or others. But I think from the US perspective, in a global environment, there'll always be Americans that are interested in this, as this foundation and the ones associated with it suggest. And people will always want to be supportive of those that are striving, trying to do better. At times you may feel ignored, and at times you are ignored, but people within the country themselves are ignored as well. But I think that's the best long-range strategy. And then connect also with the international bodies. You know, one of the benefits of the World Bank or IMF or some of these other institutions is you can tap into international expertise on some of these ideas. You can learn from others in the process. This reflects a little bit of my own political economy bias, but make it a good place to do business. I mean, you know, welcome investment, welcome business. You can, of course, regulate it and supervise it and make sure that it doesn't rip you off. But on the other hand, don't scare it away, because the lesson of the East Asian economic development is that the key for workforces and for livelihoods is to sort of draw the best from that system. So whether it's the book or the US circumstances, I'll just say this. One other reason I've always tried to talk with this group is because I think the Rumsfeld Foundation has done something very important beyond what it does for each of you individually, which is the network that it creates. So, you know, part of the problem of the region was, of course, coming out of the former Soviet Union, is kind of some of the separateness, this question of how much national autarky, how much sort of integration. And I've noticed, it's sad I can't see you directly, but in the past when I worked with different groups with the fellows, I've noticed the networks that people create. And I think the foundation tries to keep those across different classes too. That's an asset. You know, we live in a network society. So you have an advantage by simply being part of this program. I hope you use it well, and I hope you use it to help others.
Thank you so much. We so appreciate you spending the time with us, answering these questions. We'll make sure everyone reads your book when it comes out, August 4th. But thank you so much, Bob, and thank you to everyone for tuning in, and have a great rest of your days. Take care.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks to all of you.
Bye.